Before the story begins, please let me know in the comments what state or country you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you more stories like this one. The private helicopter touched down on the rooftop helipad of the Vance Tower at exactly 7:52 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. From inside the glass-walled penthouse boardroom on the 42nd floor, 41 executives, board members, and senior directors had gathered for the emergency shareholders meeting. But none of them were looking at the agenda printouts in front of them. They were all staring at the woman stepping off the helicopter. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and ivory trousers. Her dark hair was pulled back with precision. No jewelry except a single diamond watch on her left wrist. The kind of woman who did not need to raise her voice to command a room. The kind of woman who walked in and made everyone inside straighten their posture without meaning to. Her name was Celeste Vance. And 3 years ago, her husband had kissed her forehead in this very building, promised he would be back in 6 months, and boarded a flight to Singapore. He did come back, just not the way she expected. But we will get to that. First, let me tell you about the woman who stepped off that helicopter. Celeste Barlow had never been handed anything in her life. She grew up in a modest neighborhood in Nashville, Tennessee, the eldest daughter of a high school chemistry teacher and a woman who worked double shifts at a hospital administration desk. Her parents were not poor, but they were careful. They clipped coupons. They drove used cars. They taught Celeste that money was not something you waited to receive. It was something you built, brick by brick, decision by decision, year after year of showing up when it was inconvenient and staying focused when everything around you was noise. At 18, she won a partial scholarship to a state university and paid the rest herself through a combination of waitressing, tutoring, and a fierce, bone-deep refusal to quit. Not the performative kind of toughness that people announce to get credit for it. The quiet kind. The kind that does not look like anything from the outside because it never stops working long enough to be seen. She graduated summa cum laude with a double major in finance and corporate strategy. She took her first job at a mid-sized investment firm in Atlanta and within 3 years had tripled 2 of their underperforming portfolios. Her colleagues were polite to her face and privately dismissive behind closed doors, as people in certain industries tend to be about women who outperform them early. She noticed. She said nothing. She went home and worked harder and came back the next day and let the numbers do the talking. By 28, she was running an entire division. By 31, she was being headhunted by some of the largest private equity firms in the country. That was also the year she met Daniel Vance. Daniel was the golden son of the Vance family. His father had built Vance Holdings from the ground up in the 80s and early 90s, a sprawling conglomerate that held interests in commercial real estate, logistics infrastructure, and regional hospitality chains across the southeastern United States. When Daniel's father passed, he left the company to his only son with the expectation that Daniel would carry it forward with the same relentless vision that had built it. Daniel was charming and smart in the way that men who have never been truly tested often are. He could walk into a room and dazzle people with his confidence. He had his father's name, his father's face, and enough of his father's business instincts to seem, from the outside, like the real thing. But the people who had worked closely with the elder Mr. Vance for years privately worried about his son. Daniel was the kind of man who knew how to take credit for things that were already working. He was far less certain when things needed to be built from nothing. He was brilliant at the performance of competence. The substance behind the performance was where he got thinner. He met Celeste at an industry gala in Charlotte. She was there representing the investment firm. He was there because events like this were where men like Daniel existed. He pursued her with the singular focus of a man who recognized, immediately and instinctively, that this woman was something different. Not a trophy, a force. She was the sharpest person at the table every time she opened her mouth, and she opened it rarely, which somehow made it sharper. She did not perform intelligence. She simply operated with it, the way some people operate with extraordinary physical coordination, not noticing it, not showing it off, just using it because it was there. Daniel Vance, who had grown up watching his father surround himself with the most capable people in every room, understood that Celeste Barlow was the most capable person at that gala. He wanted her the way certain men want things that they instinctively understand will make them better. Whether that is love or acquisition dressed up as love is a question Celeste would spend several years trying to answer. They dated for 2 years. He proposed on a rooftop in New Orleans with a ring that had taken 3 months of his personal salary to acquire. She said yes. At the time, she believed it was love. And perhaps it was, in its early form. He made her laugh in the specific way that only a small number of people in any life are capable of. He was generous. Genuinely and spontaneously generous, not the calculated kind. He introduced her to his world without condescension. He did not seem threatened by her. And when she joined Vance Holdings as a strategic advisor shortly after their engagement, he stood in front of the entire company at an all-hands meeting and told every single person in that room that his fiancée was one of the most brilliant financial minds he had ever encountered and that the company was fortunate to have her. At the time, she had thought that was the most romantic thing he had ever done. Looking at him at that podium, saying those words in front of 300 employees, she felt something open and warm in her chest. She did not yet understand that what he had really done, knowingly or not, was hand the company a roadmap to exactly how indispensable she would become. And the day that indispensability stopped feeling like a shared achievement and started feeling like something he needed but resented needing, that was the day the fracture began. They married quietly. A small ceremony in the mountains of North Carolina, just family and 30 close friends. No press, no grand spectacle. Celeste had specifically requested it that way. She was not interested in being the centerpiece of a social display. She was interested in building something real. And for the first 4 years of their marriage, it felt like they were doing exactly that. She formally joined the Vance Holdings executive team as Chief Operating Officer. What had been bleeding from multiple divisions when she arrived began to stabilize, then grow. She restructured the logistics arm from the ground up, eliminating 3 redundant management layers and rebuilding the vendor contracts with terms that saved the company $11 million in the first year alone. She renegotiated 3 anchor tenant contracts in their real estate portfolio that had been hemorrhaging value and quietly identified a mid-sized hospitality chain in the Carolinas that the company acquired and turned into a significant revenue stream within 18 months. The board loved her. The long-tenured employees respected her in the way people respect someone who actually understands the work at every level and does not pretend to. She knew the names of the drivers who moved assets between the logistics hubs. She knew the occupancy metrics of every property in the portfolio without looking them up. She knew the numbers the way musicians know their instrument, intuitively, in the dark, without thinking about it. Daniel, to his credit, was not entirely resentful in those early years. He seemed genuinely proud of her. He would put his arm around her at company events and say, almost like a running joke that was not actually a joke, that Celeste was the reason Vance Holdings was still standing. He meant it as affection. He also meant it as truth. She accepted it as both. But over time, the joke started to feel less like affection and more like a weight he was beginning to resent carrying. Somewhere in the architecture of Daniel Vance's ego, the growing gap between what he was supposed to be and what she actually was created a foundation crack that quietly widened over years. Not loudly, not in fights or dramatic confrontations. Just in small, accumulating moments of withdrawal. He stopped attending strategy sessions as regularly. When she brought proposals to his desk, he would approve them with less and less engagement, sometimes without even reading the full summary, a signature at the bottom of a document he had skimmed in 40 seconds. He spent more time in the executive lounge with senior partners entertaining clients, and less time in the operational trenches where the real decisions were made. He started to disappear from the work he was supposed to be doing by inches. And every inch he retreated, she covered. Because the company could not stop. Because there were people depending on it. Because she was incapable of doing her job poorly regardless of whether anyone was watching. She told herself he was delegating. That he trusted her. That this was what a healthy executive partnership looked like when one party was the visionary and the other was the operator. She was choosing the most generous interpretation of a situation that, viewed without the filter of love, looked considerably less generous. Then came Singapore. The Singapore expansion had been on the Vance Holdings strategic roadmap for 2 years. A consortium of Southeast Asian investors had been in discussions about a major joint venture involving Vance's logistics infrastructure. The deal was complex, politically sensitive, and required sustained presence on the ground. Someone senior needed to lead it from the Vance side. The kind of face time and relationship investment that international deal-making requires, and that cannot be done from a distance. Daniel volunteered himself. Celeste was surprised but not alarmed.
He was the CEO.
It made sense for him to anchor the international relationship. She would hold down the domestic operations.
It would be a 6-month stint, he said.
Maybe 8 at the most. He would fly back every 6 weeks or so. They would make it work. Plenty of couples in their industry managed extended travel schedules and maintained strong marriages. This was the cost of ambition at a certain level. They both understood that. The morning he left, he stood in their kitchen in their Atlanta home and held both of her hands in his. He was wearing his favorite navy suit. His luggage was already in the car waiting downstairs. He looked at her with the particular expression he had, the one that mixed confidence and something more vulnerable underneath it, something she had always found endearing because it was the most honest part of him.
"I need you to keep the lights on here," he said.
"You are so much better at that than I am. You know that." She had smiled, told him she would,
kissed him at the door,
watched his car pull out of the driveway. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried at driveways. She was a woman who made lists. She went back inside, poured herself a second cup of coffee, opened her laptop, and started working through the morning. There was a board presentation at 10, a vendor renegotiation call at 2, a review of the Carolina hospitality numbers at 4. She had things to do. She did not know it then, but she had just said goodbye to the marriage. She had not said goodbye to the man because she did not know yet that the man she was married to was already in the process of becoming someone else. Or perhaps more accurately, was in the process of finally becoming who he had always been when no one who knew him well was watching. The first 6 months passed without significant incident. Daniel called regularly, though the calls were shorter than she would have liked, filled with vague updates about meetings and relationship building and the peculiar, maddening slowness of international deal timelines. She told herself this was normal. Big deals were slow. Patience was a professional skill she had cultivated for years. She applied it here. She sent him detailed company updates every 2 weeks. He responded with brief acknowledgments that sometimes arrived 3 days late. By month 8, the calls were coming every other week. By month 10, once a month. She noticed. She said nothing. She worked. At the 1-year mark, Daniel called during a board meeting, and she stepped out to take it in the corridor outside the conference room, which she would not normally do for a personal call, but for her husband, she made the exception. He told her the Singapore deal was taking longer than expected. He would need to extend his stay by at least 6 months, possibly longer. He apologized in the distracted way of someone who is not entirely present in the apology. He said he missed her. He said things would get back to normal soon. He said the deal was close, almost there, just needed a bit more time. She believed him. That was her last significant mistake in this chapter of her life. What she did not know, because Daniel had been careful in the way that people who are living double lives become instinctively careful, was that somewhere in the social orbit of the Singapore business world, Daniel Vance had met a woman named Priya Ko. Priya was the daughter of one of the consortium investors. She was 27 years old. She was educated in the way that people educated at good schools in beautiful cities tend to be, broadly and elegantly, without the specific scarring depth that comes from having needed education as a weapon. She was beautiful in a way that was easy to look at, not complicated by history or armor, or the particular intensity that accumulates in a woman who has had to fight for everything she has. She was warm and uncomplicated and delighted by Daniel in a way that felt entirely uncritical. She looked at Daniel Vance the way women had looked at him before he married Celeste. Like he was the most interesting man in the room. Like his stories deserved to be listened to rather than gently redirected. Like his confidence was a quality to admire rather than a performance to manage around. She asked him about himself with genuine interest and gave him the floor and let him be the main character of every story he told about his own life. Daniel, who had spent 4 years watching his wife be the most capable person in every room they shared, who had spent 4 years aware on some deep, uncomfortable level that the company that bore his family's name was actually running on the engine of his wife's mind, found this feeling intoxicating. Not because Priya was superior to Celeste. She was not. She was simply uncomplicated. And being with someone who did not silently and effortlessly eclipse you, even in a loving way, was a relief that a certain kind of man mistakes for happiness. They began to spend time together. Then more time. Then the kind of time that required explanation. Daniel and Priya were married in a private ceremony in Singapore 22 months after his arrival. He did not tell Celeste before it happened. He did not file for divorce first. He did not, by any definition, legal, moral, or practical, have the right to do what he did. But he did it anyway, with the particular carelessness of someone who has always believed, at the foundational level of their self-concept, that the consequences of their choices would ultimately be manageable, that people who loved him would absorb the damage, that the infrastructure would hold even if he set fire to parts of it. Celeste found out through a photograph. One of her former colleagues at a different firm sent her a message with a screenshot attached. No words, just the image. It was from a social media post by someone in the Singapore social circuit. Daniel in a white linen suit, standing on a wide terrace overlooking the water in the deep gold light of a late afternoon. A young woman in a cream dress standing beside him, leaning slightly into his shoulder. Both of them looking at the camera with the relaxed radiance of people who believe their happiness is entirely earned and entirely permanent. The caption read, "The beginning of our forever." Celeste stared at the photograph for a long time. She was sitting at her desk at Vance Holdings headquarters. It was a Wednesday afternoon in autumn. She could hear Brianna on the phone in the outer office. The building's ventilation system ran its quiet, steady hum. From 42 floors below came the faint, periodic sound of Atlanta traffic.
She set her phone face down on the desk.
She did not scream. She did not shatter the glass of water sitting 2 inches from her elbow. She did not call Daniel. She did not call her mother. She did not call her best friend, a woman named Grace who had known her since college and who would have driven to the office and sat with her without being asked if Celeste had given any indication she needed that. She did not call her lawyer, not yet. She sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. She was aware that her heart was beating faster than usual. She was aware of a sensation in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite grief, and was perhaps most accurately described as the physical recognition of something that had been true for longer than she had been willing to know. The photograph was not a revelation. It was a confirmation. And the particular weight of a confirmation is that it closes doors that some part of you had been keeping open without fully admitting it. She sat with that for 4 minutes. Then she picked up her phone, turned it back over, looked at the photograph one more time, and made a decision that would take the next 34 months to fully execute, but that was complete in her mind within the first 30 seconds of making it. She was going to take everything, not in a messy, impulsive way. Not in the way of a woman destroyed by betrayal who reaches for the nearest weapon. She was not destroyed. She was something colder and more precise than destroyed. She was clarified. And what she was going to do next was going to be the most thorough, well-documented, legally unassailable piece of work she had ever produced. She was going to build it the way she had built everything, carefully, methodically, and completely. The first call she made was to her personal attorney, a woman named Margaret Holt who had been practicing family and corporate law in Atlanta for 30 years and who had the energy of someone who had seen every variety of human behavior and been surprised by precisely none of it. Celeste laid out the situation in 4 concise minutes. Margaret listened without a single interruption, which was one of the things Celeste valued most about her. "You have leverage you are not yet aware of," Margaret said when Celeste finished. "Tell me all of it," Celeste said. What followed was a 2-hour conversation that reshaped the way Celeste thought about the next phase of her life. Margaret walked her through the full picture, the corporate structure of Vance Holdings, the provisions in the original incorporation documents that Daniel had signed without reading carefully, the provisions in the estate documents from his father's estate that had been incorporated into the company governance framework, and the legal status of bigamy under Georgia state law and its implications for asset division in a divorce proceeding. The core of Margaret's analysis was this: Daniel Vance had not actually been running Vance Holdings for the past year and a half. Celeste had been. The operational decisions, the financial restructuring, the strategic direction, the key relationships with the board, the institutional knowledge that lived in no document anywhere because it lived inside Celeste's mind, and in the daily decisions she made, and in the respect and trust of the people who actually did the work. It was all hers. It had always been hers in the functional sense even when it bore his name. And in the original incorporation structure of Vance Holdings, as revised during the estate planning process following Daniel's father's death, there was a provision that allowed for the appointment of an internal executive trustee in the event that the primary shareholder was determined to be substantially and documentably disengaged from company operations. This provision existed because Daniel's father, who had seen his own father lose a business to extended illness and absence, had been meticulous about protecting his company from precisely this kind of leadership vacuum. He had not wanted the business to dissolve because the person at the top stopped showing up. Daniel had signed it because it had been presented to him in a stack of documents at the end of a long estate closing process, and he had trusted his father's lawyers and had not read it with the attention it deserved. The provision had never been triggered. It required a formal board finding of executive disengagement, supported by documented evidence of operational absence across a sustained period, and a petition from at least 3 senior board members.
It was designed to be hard to activate.
The bar was high specifically, so it could not be used frivolously. But it was not impossible. Celeste said nothing for a moment after Margaret finished explaining. Then she said, "How long would it take?" Margaret said, "If you are patient and you are meticulous and you do not make a single move before you are ready, somewhere between 2 and 3 years." Celeste was quiet for one more moment. Then she said, "Start the clock." What happened over the next 34 months would later be studied, with the identifying details changed, in at least one business school curriculum. The case study described it as a model of strategic patience and organizational restructuring under conditions of leadership vacuum. It did not describe the woman sitting in her office at midnight making sure every board relationship was documented, every operational performance metric was attributed accurately, every absence logged and time-stamped. The case study had the shape of the outcome without the texture of how it was built. The texture was this: Celeste Barlow Vance, in the 34 months following the discovery of the photograph, quietly, systematically, and entirely legally engineered a transfer of operational and eventually structural control of Vance Holdings from her absent husband to herself. She did it through cultivating the board relationships that had been hers in practice for years into something formally and contractually significant. She did it through a documented record of Daniel's operational absence so thorough and so consistent that any legal challenge to its accuracy would have been professional suicide for whoever attempted it. She did it through financial performance so strong and so consistently attributable to her specific decisions that the board's loyalty to her became professionally logical rather than personally motivated. And she did it through 3 specific moves that, viewed individually, might have looked like ordinary professional decisions. Viewed together, they were a blueprint. The first was a quiet, off-market acquisition of a 15% ownership stake in Vance Holdings from a retiring early investor who had held shares since the company's founding era and who was ready to liquidate at a fair price. The transaction was handled through a subsidiary entity that Margaret had structured for exactly this purpose. It was entirely legal. It was conducted with full transparency to the relevant regulatory bodies. And it shifted Celeste's position in the company from that of a highly compensated employee to that of a significant personal stakeholder. The second was the completion of the Singapore deal. Not the version Daniel had been fumbling for 3 years, but a structurally different and dramatically more favorable version that Celeste negotiated directly with the consortium. She did it through a series of video calls spanning 4 months and a single strategic in-person trip to Singapore, during which she did not inform Daniel she was in the city until she was already on her way back to the airport. The deal closed at terms that were 40% better than Daniel's most optimistic projections. The consortium partners told her privately, over dinner the night before she flew home, that they had found the previous 2 years of negotiations frustrating and circular, and that her arrival with a clear, properly structured proposal had changed everything in 3 weeks. The board had not expected it. When she presented the final terms, there was a silence in the boardroom that was not confusion. It was a particular kind of quiet that happens when people are recalibrating their understanding of something they thought they already understood. The third move was the one that sealed everything. 3 months before Daniel's eventual return to the United States, 2 of the 5 Vance Holdings board members who had been most deeply loyal to the Vance family name submitted a formal petition to the full board requesting a review of the company's executive leadership structure. The petition ran to 11 pages. It cited 37 months of documented operational absence by the sitting CEO, a list of 42 board meetings and strategic sessions for which no communication, no participation, and no formal delegation of authority had been provided by the CEO's office. An analysis of the company's financial trajectory under the COO's operational leadership and the relevant clause from the original incorporation governance documents, highlighted and annotated with 3 years of documented evidence that the threshold conditions for its activation had been met. The petition asked the board to formally recognize what had been functionally true for 3 years. The board convened a special session. They reviewed the documentation for 2 weeks. They retained outside counsel to verify the legal standing of the petition and the governance provision. Then they voted. 4-1. Celeste Barlow Vance was appointed executive chairwoman and interim CEO of Vance Holdings, pending the formal resolution of the executive leadership review. She received the board's notification on a Tuesday morning. She was in her office. She read the email twice, set her phone face down for exactly 1 minute, then picked it up again, typed a brief acknowledgement to the board secretary, and went back to the work on her desk. There was still a full day ahead of her. Daniel Vance arrived back in the United States on a Friday morning in early October. He came in on a commercial flight from Singapore through Dubai and London, the particular kind of journey that is long enough to have thought through what you are going to say several times and still feel unprepared when the car pulls up to the house. He had not informed Celeste of his arrival date. He had told his assistant, because he needed a car waiting at the airport. He had not considered the possibility that his assistant, who had been at Vance Holdings for 11 years and whose professional loyalty had shifted definitively over the past 3 years to the woman who actually came to work every morning and made the decisions, would mention the arrival date to Celeste. Not from malice. Just from the ordinary instinct of someone who reports to one person and has stopped thinking of another person as their real employer. He pulled up to the Atlanta home in the back of a black car, with Priya sitting quietly beside him and 2 large suitcases in the trunk. He had a plan, in the way that people who are about to do something difficult to someone they have hurt construct a plan to make themselves feel prepared. He would come home, have the difficult conversation, offer a fair settlement, and then begin the process of re-engaging with the company. He assumed the divorce would be unpleasant but manageable. He had built up a specific mental picture of how this conversation would go. Celeste upset, dignified, reluctantly accepting. Him apologetic but firm. Both of them moving forward in a structured, adult way. He had the mental picture of a man who did not yet know that while he had been building a new life in Singapore, his wife had been building a different kind of future entirely. He used his key at the front door. The house was immaculate, the way it had always been. Fresh flowers on the entryway table, the lights on, the specific scent of the candle Celeste kept in the living room. For a moment Daniel felt something odd pass through him, a kind of vertigo, as though he had walked back into the exact life he had left and found it had continued without him so completely that his absence had left no imprint at all. Then Celeste walked into the entryway from the direction of the kitchen. She was holding a mug of tea. She was wearing a silk blouse and tailored trousers. Her hair was down. She looked exactly as she had always looked, composed, present, completely settled in herself. She looked at him, then at Priya, who was standing slightly behind him near the door, holding her handbag in both hands and looking at the house with the expression of someone who is not sure whether she should step further inside or wait to be invited. Daniel cleared his throat. He said the things he had rehearsed on the plane. He explained about Priya, that they had gotten close during his time in Singapore, that he had not handled things the way he should have, that the marriage had been struggling long before he left, and the distance had made it clear that they had grown in different directions, that Priya was now his wife, and that he was asking Celeste to understand that this was the reality now, and he wanted to handle everything fairly and respectfully. He used the word complicated 4 times. He said he was sorry for the way things had unfolded. He talked for several minutes. His voice had the particular quality of a man delivering a prepared speech to someone who is not responding the way the prepared version anticipated, because Celeste was listening to him the way she listened to presentations that did not quite add up. Completely still, completely attentive, giving nothing. When he finished, there was a brief pause. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, the way people say the things they have not examined closely enough to realize how they sound, that obviously there would need to be some adjustments around the house, living situation, and all that. That Celeste would need to work out her own arrangements for the time being, but that he would make sure she was taken care of financially. He was not that kind of person, she knew that. They would figure it out like adults. He said, just manage the house for now while we sort the rest out. Manage the house. Celeste looked at him for a long moment after he said that. She took one sip of her tea, set the mug down on the entryway table, precisely beside the fresh flowers. Picked up the slim leather portfolio she had left there that morning, which Daniel had not noticed because he had been focused on delivering his speech. She looked at him one final time. Not with anger. Not with the specific grief of a woman who has been humiliated by someone she trusted. With something quieter than that. The expression of someone who has closed a very long account and confirmed the final balance. Then she walked past him. Past Priya, who stepped back slightly against the door without quite meaning to. Past the 2 suitcases. Down the 2 front steps to the driveway, where a black SUV was already waiting with her driver behind the wheel. Daniel turned. He called her name. There was something in his voice that might have been alarm. Might have been the first crack in the prepared speech. The first moment of realizing that the conversation was not going the way he had imagined it. She did not slow down. She did not look back. The SUV door closed behind her. The driver knew where to go. He had already been told. The drive to the Vance Tower took 14 minutes. The elevator to the rooftop took 45 seconds. The helicopter pilot was already seated, and the rotors were already turning by the time she climbed in and put on the headset. She nodded to the pilot. They rose above the city. Below, Atlantis spread out in the early morning light. The grid of streets, the glass towers, the green patches of the parks. She had looked at this city from this height more times than she could count. It always looked the same and somehow always looked different. Today it looked like hers. She had a board meeting in 40 minutes. She was not going to be late. Back at the house, Daniel Vance stood in the entryway for a long moment after the SUV pulled away. The silence of the house was different now. The flowers on the table, the candle smell, all of it still present, still perfect, but suddenly and completely impersonal, as though it had been staged. His phone began to ring. The first call was from his personal assistant, who told him in a voice of complete professional neutrality that his access credentials to the Vance Holdings executive systems had been suspended as part of an ongoing leadership review, and that formal written notification had been sent to the email address on file, an address he had not checked in 6 weeks. The second call was from the head of the Vance Holdings legal department, who informed him that the board had filed a formal governance resolution with the state corporate registry and that a complete advisory packet had been sent to his legal representatives. The third call was from an attorney he did not recognize, who identified herself as calling on behalf of Margaret Holt's office, advising him that the divorce proceedings filed 14 months prior were active and proceeding, and that his legal team should prepare for a comprehensive asset review given the documentation on file. Daniel stood in the entryway of the house. His name on the deed. His family's name on the company 40 minutes across town. He made a sound that was not a word. Priya watched him from across the entry hall. She had been very quiet since they arrived. She had listened to Daniel's prepared speech to his wife. She had watched the wife pick up a portfolio and walk out the door. She had watched Daniel's certainty, which had been so palpable on the flight home, drain out of him in real time as his phone rang and rang. She had come to Atlanta believing she was arriving at the life Daniel had described to her. A company. A home. A man who ran things. A transition that would be uncomfortable but manageable because Daniel Vance knew how to manage things. She was beginning, with a cold clarity that arrived in her chest like ice water, to understand that the life Daniel had described and the life that actually existed were not the same size. The board meeting that Tuesday morning lasted 3 hours. Celeste presented the Q3 performance review with the full supporting data. She walked the board through the final confirmed terms of the Singapore joint venture, which produced a round of applause from the usually restrained group that lasted longer than she expected. She presented a restructuring proposal for the Southern Hospitality Division that would reduce operational overhead by 12% in the following fiscal year, while improving net margin on each property. And then she presented a 5-year strategic growth plan that one of the oldest board members, a man who had been at the company since Daniel's father's era and who had watched Celeste work for 4 years, described afterward in a private message to a colleague as the clearest and most credible long-range document he had seen in this building in a decade. When the meeting ended and the room emptied, Celeste stayed at the head of the table for a moment. She looked out the glass walls at the Atlanta skyline. She had been looking at this view for 4 years. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, most accurately, like herself. More precisely herself than she had felt in a long time. She gathered her materials and went back to her office. There were 43 unread emails. She began working through them. Brianna knocked on the open door. Daniel Vance had arrived in the lobby and was requesting to come up. Celeste thought for one moment, then told Brianna to have security escort him to the small conference room on 38 and have him wait there. Not the boardroom. The small one. She finished the email she was writing, answered 2 more, then took the elevator to 38. Daniel was sitting at the table in the small conference room. He had not changed clothes since the morning. He looked different in this building than he had in the entryway of the house. Smaller. The building had always been his context, his family's building, his name over the door, but it did not recognize him the same way anymore. The receptionist had asked for his ID. The badge reader had not accepted his old code. The woman at the security desk had called upstairs before permitting him to proceed. He looked up when she walked in and closed the door behind her. He started talking almost immediately. His voice had the quality of someone who has been sitting alone with their thoughts for too long and is now releasing pressure. He said she had to understand there had been a mistake or an overreach. He was still the CEO. His family had built this company. The board did not have the authority to simply remove him. Whatever documents had been filed were going to be challenged. He was not going to accept being locked out of his own company. He talked for several minutes. Celeste let him finish.
Completely.
She did not interrupt. She waited until the last word was out of his mouth and the air in the room was still again. Then she opened her portfolio and slid a document across the table. 6 pages. Cleanly formatted. A complete timeline of his documented absences from company operations. The full board resolution text. The equity transfer records. The relevant clauses from the original incorporation governance documents, highlighted. The divorce filing status summary. He read it. He was a smart man in the fundamental sense of the word. He read quickly, and he understood what he was reading. She watched his face as he moved through the pages. She watched the specific moment when he arrived at the equity transfer section and the color changed in his face, and the precise nature of the situation became clear to him. He set the document down. He asked her how. She told him, factually, without cruelty and without warmth, the way you described the mechanics of something that has already happened. He had been absent from the company for 3 years and 2 months. The board had documented the absence. The governance provision that his father had written into the incorporation structure and that he had signed without reading carefully had provided the legal mechanism. The equity she had acquired through Margaret's subsidiary structure had provided the ownership standing. The performance record had provided the board's confidence. None of it was irregular. All of it was visible in the filings if someone had been paying attention. He asked why she had not told him, not warned him. She looked at him. You did not tell me about Priya before you married her, she said. You did not warn me. I found out from a photograph someone sent me at my desk in this building on a Wednesday afternoon. The conference room was very quiet. He asked what happened now. She told him. The divorce proceedings would continue under the terms already on file. The settlement framework was prepared and reviewed and was legally grounded and, she said this plainly, generous given the circumstances. He would retain a minority equity position in the company based on the original inheritance structure because that was fair and because she was not interested in taking what was not hers to take. But operational and governance control would remain with the board and with her position as executive chairwoman. He would not be returning as CEO. If he wished to discuss a non-executive advisory role at some point in the future, that conversation was possible. But it was not today's conversation. If he wished to contest any of this, she had 34 months of documentation, a board resolution voted 4-1, a legal team that had been preparing for this precise moment for over a year, and the additional context of the bigamy issue, which in Georgia created a set of legal complications he would want his attorneys to brief him on thoroughly before deciding on a posture. She said all of this in the same voice she used in board presentations. Even, clear, final. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, with something in his voice that was neither legal nor strategic, whether she had ever loved him. She looked at him for a long moment. "I built everything you were supposed to be," she said. "Make of that what you will." She stood up, picked up her portfolio, and walked out of the conference room. The elevator took her back to 42. She went back to her desk. She had 2 more meetings that afternoon, and a call with the Singapore Consortium at 5. She got to work. The legal process moved with the steady, inevitable momentum of something that had been in motion for a long time. Daniel retained counsel. His attorneys reviewed what they had been given and came back in considerably more measured tones than Daniel's initial instructions had demanded. The bigamy issue created a specific legal context that made aggressive posturing inadvisable. The documentation Celeste's team had compiled over 34 months was thorough enough that contesting the core findings would have required resources, time, and a narrative that did not exist. The settlement was reached in 41 days. It gave Daniel sufficient resources to rebuild independently without ongoing legal conflict. It was not the outcome he would have designed for himself. It was the outcome that 3 years of absence had created for him. Priya Vance spent approximately 3 weeks in Atlanta before returning to Singapore. She had arrived believing one version of the story. She had encountered the actual version and found them irreconcilable. The annulment process began. Her attorneys described her as composed but resolute. She had made a decision based on incorrect information, and she was correcting the decision with as little additional damage as possible. Daniel kept the Atlanta house. Celeste had not wanted it. She had already moved into a modern apartment 2 miles from the tower. Clean lines and wide windows, and the kind of space that feels like the person who lives there chose it for themselves, for exactly who they are, rather than for what they were building together with someone else. The kitchen was smaller than the one she had left. She did not cook much anyway. There was a coffee shop at street level that she liked, and a running path along the park 3 blocks west that she used 3 mornings a week. She kept the watch. The one she had bought herself the year she closed her first major restructuring deal, the year she proved to herself that she was as good as she had always quietly known she was. She had been wearing it on the helicopter that Tuesday morning. She would wear it for the rest of her professional life, and it would mean, to her, the specific thing it had always meant, that she had built herself, and she had built it well. 6 months after the helicopter morning, the board made the appointment permanent. The vote was unanimous. Celeste Barlow Vance became the official, full-term CEO of Vance Holdings. The announcement went out on a Tuesday. She had not planned that timing, but she noted it, with something close to private amusement, when Brianna handed her the press release to review. The coverage in the financial press was substantive. The story of the company's performance over the past 3 years, combined with the leadership transition, combined with the international deal close, gave journalists enough to work with. The coverage described her as a turnaround architect, as the operational force behind a decade's worth of stability, as a rare executive who had built something quietly and completely and then been formally recognized for it. Some of the coverage mentioned the personal circumstances. She had instructed Margaret and her communications team to offer no comment on the personal dimensions. She did not need the sympathy narrative. She did not need the story of the wronged wife who persevered. That was a real story. It had happened to her, but it was not the story she was interested in telling. The story she was interested in telling was the company's numbers. The 43% margin improvement over 3 years. The Singapore deal terms. The hospitality division recovery. The equity structure. Those were the numbers that mattered, and they told the story more clearly and permanently than any personal narrative could. Her mother called when the announcement went public. She said, in the tone of a woman who has watched her daughter her entire life and has never been entirely surprised by anything she has done, "I always knew." Celeste laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind, the kind she did not always have time for during the week.
"I know you did," she said.
She had dinner with her mother that weekend. They cooked together in the small kitchen. Her mother brought wine. They talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with the company or Daniel Vance or the past 3 years or helicopters or boardrooms. They talked about Nashville and about Celeste's father and about a trip her mother wanted to take and about a novel her mother had just finished that she thought Celeste should read. On the drive home, Celeste sat in the back of the car and watched the city go by outside the window and felt, not triumphant and not relieved and not sad, but something that was perhaps most accurately called settled. The specific feeling of a person who has done what they came to do and is now simply here in the life they built, in the world as it actually is. There were things she had lost. Real things. Years when she had believed she was building a partnership and had been building something more solitary than she knew. The specific texture of being loved by a person you chose and who chose you back, which is not something you can replicate or substitute for no matter how successful you become. She had grieved that. Privately, early in the mornings before the building filled with people, she had sat with the weight of it. She had done all of that, and she had not let it stop her from doing what needed to be done, but she had not pretended it was nothing either. It had been something. It had been significant. She was not so armored that she pretended otherwise.
But she was also not destroyed by it.
And perhaps that was the most important thing. Not that she had won, not that she had outmaneuvered him, not that she had taken the company from underneath a man who had not deserved it. Those things had happened, and they were real. But the most important thing was that she had not let someone else's failure of vision define the ceiling of her life. She had looked at what she was and what she could do, and she had decided that was enough to build with. And she had been right. There is a particular thing that happens to people who have been underestimated for a long time and who keep working anyway.
Not to all of them.
But to the ones who are paying attention and who refuse to let the underestimation become their own belief about themselves. Something clarifies. The noise falls away. The social performance, the management of other people's comfort, the careful modulation of your own capabilities so as not to unsettle the people around you, all of it stops being necessary because you stop requiring their permission. What remains is just the work. Just the thing you are actually here to do. Celeste had always known, in the deep, quiet way that some people know the most important things about themselves before they have language for it, that she was here to build. That the architecture of companies and deals and strategy was not just what she was good at, but what she was for. Daniel had called her the reason Vance Holdings was still standing, and he had meant it as a compliment about her talent and her capability. He had not understood that he was also, in that sentence, describing the full and complete scope of what she was in that building and in that company and in his life. She had not corrected him because she had loved him and because she had hoped that love and capability together were enough to make something real and lasting. She had been wrong about the lasting part, but not, she thought, about the love. The love had been real. The love had simply not been sufficient to change the particular limitation that was his, not hers. That was a hard thing to know. It was also, eventually, a freeing thing to know. She did not manage the house. She had never been the person who managed the house. She had been the person who managed everything, including the parts of him that needed managing, and she had done it because she had chosen to and because she had believed it was building toward something. When it became clear that it had not been, she had stopped and turned and done something different. That was all it was. That simple and that enormous. On the 1-year anniversary of the helicopter morning, Celeste flew to Singapore for the first strategic review meeting with the consortium under the full terms of the joint venture. She stayed for 4 days. She worked hard during the days, and on the final evening walked through a market near the harbor and ate something she could not identify, but that was the best thing she had tasted in months. She stood at the edge of the water in the late evening light and looked at the skyline reflected in the harbor and felt nothing dramatic about being in the city where her marriage had ended. She felt curious about the food. She felt satisfied with the day's work. She felt the particular piece of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. She flew home on a Tuesday morning. The helicopter was waiting on the tower rooftop. She climbed in and nodded to the pilot and rose above the city and looked out at Atlantis spreading below her in the morning light. The same geometry it always was, glass and history and accumulated effort. She had a 9 o'clock meeting, then a call with the Carolina team, then a budget review, then lunch with Brianna, who had asked if they could have a proper lunch sometime, the kind that is not at a desk, and Celeste had said yes because Brianna had earned it many times over and because there were people in this life worth making time for. She looked out at the city. She thought about the work ahead. She was ready. For anyone reading this story who has been told that their role is to manage the house, to hold things together quietly, while someone else gets to be the main character of a life you helped build, the person saying that has already counted you out. They have looked at everything you are and decided it fits neatly inside their expectations of you, and they have made that decision without your permission. Sometimes those people discover later how wrong they were. Sometimes they never do. Either way, you do not need them to know it for it to be true. What Celeste understood, by the morning she stepped off the helicopter and walked into her boardroom, was that she had never actually needed permission from anyone to be what she was. She had believed she did for a long time, in the specific way that people who love someone begin to make that person's recognition a condition of their own reality. She had thought, if he sees me, then I am seen. If he values me, then I have value. That was the part that had been wrong. Not the love, but the dependency of her self-knowledge on his reflection of it. She had been building the whole time. She would have been building regardless. The company had grown because of her work, not because of his permission. The Singapore deal had closed because of her preparation and her credibility and her ability to sit across from a table of sophisticated investors and make them believe, correctly, that she knew exactly what she was doing. All of that existed independently of whether Daniel Vance was watching. She had just needed to remember that. And the 34 months had given her time to remember it completely. She walked into her boardroom on that Tuesday morning as the executive chairwoman and interim CEO of Vance Holdings. She had somewhere to be. She had always had somewhere to be. She was not late. There is one more thing worth saying about Celeste Barlow Vance, and it is this. 3 months after she became permanent CEO, she hired a new head of strategy. The candidate was a young woman, 29 years old, who had been passed over twice for promotions at a competitor firm despite running 2 of the most successful product launches in that company's recent history. Her direct manager, a man 15 years her senior who took credit for both launches in his annual performance review, had described her in internal documents as extremely capable, but perhaps not yet ready for the additional visibility of a senior leadership role. She had been passed over. She had kept working. She had heard about the opening at Vance Holdings and applied. Celeste met with her for 90 minutes. Afterward, she told Brianna to draft the offer letter that afternoon. When the woman accepted and came in for her first day, Celeste met her at the elevator bank and walked her to her office herself, rather than delegating it to HR. She introduced her to the team personally. She said, in front of the assembled division, that this woman had built 2 of the most significant commercial programs in her previous firm and that Vance Holdings was fortunate to have found her. She said it in the same tone Daniel had used at the all-hands meeting years ago, the one where she had felt seen for the first time in a professional context. She said it because she knew what it felt like to have someone with authority say clearly and publicly, this person's work is real, and she is here, and she belongs here. She also said it because it was true. The woman was extraordinary. And in Celeste Barlow Vance's company, extraordinary was what you hired and what you named and what you protected. The new head of strategy lasted exactly 2 quarters before she restructured the entire strategic planning function and reduced the company's planning cycle time by 40%. She was made a senior vice president in month 7. She was on the shortlist for the next open board seat by month 14. Celeste noted this with quiet satisfaction. This was also what it meant to build something. Not just the deals and the governance documents and the 42-floor building with her family's name on the door, his family's name, but the people who came after. The ones who needed someone ahead of them to have cleared the ground, to have made the path visible, to have stood in the boardroom and said by their presence alone, yes, this is possible, this is what it looks like, now here is your office. This was the work she was actually here to do. All of it. Every part. She would not have known that without the 34 months. She would not have known it without the photograph on the desk in Atlanta on that Wednesday autumn afternoon, without the decision made in 4 minutes of silence, without every long night in the office and every carefully documented absence and every bored relationship cultivated over years and every number she could recite without checking a spreadsheet. She had needed all of it. Not because suffering is instructive, which it sometimes is and sometimes simply is not, but because the work of those 34 months had revealed to her the full scope of what she was capable of when she was doing it entirely for herself and not to earn recognition from someone who was not watching. She had been capable of all of it the whole time. Now she knew it. Now it was in the record. Now it was in the structure of the company and in the filings and in the Singapore deal terms and in the office of the new head of strategy and in the daily work of everyone in that building who had watched a woman run toward difficulty instead of away from it and decided, quietly or loudly, that this was the kind of leadership they wanted to follow. On the morning she stepped off the helicopter for the first time as executive chairwoman, she had thought, I have somewhere to be.
She still thought that.
Every morning, every Tuesday. She was never late.